Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Today, we are getting started on topic 8, 6th Dynasty Landscape Poetry. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest host, Professor Lucas Bender of Yale University. His first episode is entitled Landscapes of the Mind. Let's warmly welcome Professor Bender.
Even the most casual acquaintance with Chinese poetry will reveal that it's full of images drawn from the natural world. Sometimes these images are fragmentary, but much of the most famous Chinese verse depicts broader and often integrated scenes, what we might call landscapes, whether they be landscapes of rural areas on the outskirts of cities or wilderness landscapes further away. Landscape description became an important part of the poetic art quite early in the Chinese tradition, much earlier than it did in Europe, and once landscape began to be depicted regularly, it retained a place in poetry that was far more central than it ever has been in the West. At the outset, however, Chinese poets were interested in landscape less for itself than as a negative symbol of what it was not, the world of the court and human society. As a result, it's not until the 4th century of the Common Era that poets begin to write regularly of actual landscapes they experienced firsthand, rather than landscapes that are either generic or merely imagined. Nature imagery plays a significant role in the classic of poetry, but the mostly short poems of this early anthology do not depict integrated landscapes. Instead, some of the earliest Chinese poetry that intimates its place in a larger landscape appears in the Chu-ci. In this anthology, the mountains and waters of the Southlands appear in an ambivalent role. They're at once the site of the speaker's lamentations of exile from the courts of their times, and also the locus in which they attempt to woo the gods and goddesses who represent an alternative source of authority. This ambivalence gives the landscapes of the Chu-ci an awful beauty, haunted by divinity, but inhospitable to humans. In the poem Shangui from the 9 Songs, for example, the speaker goes out looking for the goddess of a mountain. I find myself, the poem reads, in bamboo's darkness and cannot see sky. The path steep and hard, I've come late and alone. Alone, too, she stands on the mountain's summit, with clouds billowing down below her. The sky shakes in thunder, the rain brings darkness, the apes are all wailing, and all night monkeys moan. In other poems from the Chu-ci, the landscape is even more horrible. In the Summons of the Soul and the Great Summoning, for instance, it's full of fantastical monsters that hunger for human souls. And in Summoning the Recluse, we read of mountain mists towering and rocks jagged, where valleys are sheer and waters increase their waves. Pulling yourself up on cassia branches, for a while you may linger, but tigers and leopards there battle, and bears and she-bears roar. and beasts are affrighted and lose their flocks. O prince, return home. In the mountains you cannot stay long. These poems in the Chu-ci set the precedent for landscape description in the Fu rhapsodies of the Han Dynasty as well, which sometimes describe the rugged landscapes of mountains associated with particular divinities, and sometimes describe the awesome but inhospitable wildernesses through which officials had to travel on their way to remote postings far from the capital. It's not until the Western Jin, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, that we begin to find landscape appearing in poetry in a slightly different guise. In the following poem, for example, Lu-ji inverts the old title of the Chu-ci's summoning the recluse, which had tried to persuade the recluse that he could not survive in the mountains. Where that poem summoned the recluse back to civilization, now the poet is lured out into the landscape.
The Summons of the Recluse. As light breaks, my heart is not easy. I shake out my clothes to go walk for a while. I'll go walk. Yet where should I go? The hidden one is in a deep valley. Dawns he gathers herbs from a southern torrent. Dusks he rests at West Mountain's foot. Light branches image out a towering building. Dense leaves form a halcyon curtain. Whistling brambles accumulate in magnolia groves. Circling fragrance lingers in the flowering trees. How melodious are the rivulets of the mountains, where flying cascades scour ringing jade. Mournful tones approach numinous waves, and lingering echoes spread to the deep places. Such supreme music depends on nothing. Why dilute the pure and simple? Since wealth and status cannot be guaranteed, I'll unyoke my carriage and follow my desires.
Lu-ji's is one of 10 poems surviving from the Western Jin that now bear the title The Summons of the Recluse, indicating that this had become a set topic in the period. By this time, so-called reclusion was both a stylish pose for wealthy aristocrats and, perhaps sometimes, a real practice for men of the literate classes who sought to preserve their integrity by hiding themselves away from the dangers and intrigues of court society in the landscapes beyond the capital. In this poem, therefore, Lu-ji imagines seeking out such a recluse, and finding in the landscape of his mountain hermitage natural replacements for the luxuries of the court. The recluse, he finds, does not need towering buildings or halcyon curtains, since he has a thickly leafed canopy of trees as his shelter, and he doesn't need the music that accompanied elite parties in the capital, since the woods have their own melodies. Lu-ji therefore ends the poem, resolved to give up on his ambitions within the world of men and to come join the recluse out in the beautiful, bountiful landscape he has imagined. Given the conventionality of this poem, it's unlikely that Lu-ji was really thinking about leaving the human world behind for the mountains, and indeed a fragment of a Fu rhapsody that he wrote survives, arguing that a real recluse would not have to go live in the mountains, because real reclusion was actually a state of mind that could be attained anywhere, even at court. This idea was actually just as conventional as that of the recluse out in the wilderness, and proponents of one vision or another sometimes debated which was loftier. In a poetic exchange from the early 4th century, for example, Zhang-qi and the Buddhist monk Kang Sung-yuan disagreed about whether a true Buddhist needs to leave the city behind for seclusion in a monastery in the mountains. Zhang-qi argued that if one can calm one's mind wherever one rests, no place is impure. To this, Kang Sung-yuan responded by describing a particularly pure place, Mount Hua, where he imagined purple clouds enclosing sun, moon, and stars, garnet cliffs making for spacious jeweled halls, and jade waters splashing over numinous fords. By lodging himself in such a landscape, Kang suggested that a man of serenity, immersed in the Tao and savoring the wonder of things, could roam beyond the conventional, transcending the age and leaving behind all wind-blown dust. Unlike Lu Ji, Kang Sung-yuan really was committed to leaving the human world behind for a mountain monastery. Yet if his poem follows the template of Lu Ji's quite closely, first imagining a man in the mountains and then resolving to go off and join him, it is a sign that landscape still featured in the poetry of this period more as an imagined opposite to human society than as a real experience. Part of the reason for this situation lies in contemporary ideas about the nature of reality and mind, ideas that allowed Eastern Jin intellectuals to claim that there was no real difference between imagining a mountain and experiencing it personally. Since these same ideas made mountains a privileged locus for the self-expression of the Tao, they encouraged poets like Zhi Dun and Sun Chuo to write poems and rhapsodies in which they traveled in their minds to mountains that were inaccessible to them in body. These ideas, in other words, ensured that wondrous mountain scenes made up a significant proportion of the period's poetry. At the same time, however, they also guaranteed that those scenes would remain for the most part imaginary and ideal. As a result, this poetry lacks some of the interest and complexity of the great landscape verse that was to follow in the 5th century, when poets like Tao Qian, Xie Lingyun, and Xie Tiao were to write instead of concrete personal experiences with landscapes that were not merely imaginary. The next 3 episodes will deal with these poets in more detail. To understand them, however, we will have to see how each of them is inheriting and diverging from this earlier discourse, these mountains of the mind. Tao Qian, for example, is something of a transitional figure in the landscape genre, since he made his home and wrote his poetry neither in the vast wildernesses that some poets imagined, nor in the cities they imagined them from. Tao's poetry, that is, was written in and depicts the landscape of the semi-rural area of his hometown of Chaisang, to which he returned after giving up his official career to become China's most famous recluse. Tao identifies the homestead he built in Chaisang as a sort of liminal space between the human world and the wilderness. Being outside of the capital made it easier, he claimed, to free his mind from the shackles of the mundane realm. Actually doing so, however, remained a matter of the mind, rather than of physically being in the mountains. A point Tao makes in this poem, one of the most famous in the language.
Drinking ale. I built my hut in the human realm, and yet there's no noise of horse and carriage. I ask you, how is this possible? When the mind is distant, the place becomes remote. Picking chrysanthemums by the eastern hedge, I gaze wistfully at South Mountain. The mountain's auras are lovely at dusk. Winging birds return together. In this return, there is some truth. But about to explain it, I've already forgot the words.
Among many other things, this deceptively simple poem is a meditation on the same issues that were at play in the poetic debate between Zhang-qi and Kang Sung-yuan. The question of whether one really has to go to the mountains to attain the consummations of the recluse, or whether one can simply free one's mind while living in the city. Tao places himself here in between these two positions. Though he represents his hermitage as being in the human realm, no high officials come to visit him, and though his hut is far enough from the city's dust that he can pick chrysanthemum flowers to float in his ale, he's not on Mount Lu, with its renowned places of Buddhist and Taoist retreat. There's a moment in the middle of the poem where Tao seems to wonder whether he really has gone far enough from the human world. The mountain's auras seem to be calling him, intimating that only on its peaks could he achieve a real transcendence of human limitations, and in particular of death, which the chrysanthemum flowers he's picking now will merely delay. Yet the mountain, he reflects, is the home of the birds. It's not his home. Having returned to his hometown, he is, like them, where he belongs. And like them, he may even find here his true companions, despite the fact that no horses and no carriages arrive at his hut. These true companions are his readers, or at least that portion of them who can meet with him not physically, but rather in the mind, those who remember the words of the philosopher Zhuangzi, that words are just the fish traps of meaning, and once you've got the fish, you can forget the trap. Where then can I find someone who has forgotten words, so that I might have a word with him?
Let's thank Professor Bender for such a stimulating talk. We look forward to his presentation of episode 23 next Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let's relax and listen to a reading of the poems in Mandarin.
陆机，招引诗。明发心不移，正依疗执着。执着欲安之，幽人在峻谷。朝采难见早，夕兮西山足。青条向云构，密叶成翠卧。基础筑兰陵，回芳博秀木。山溜河泠泠，飞泉漱明誉。哀音复凌波，颓响复曾曲。至月非有甲，安世交淳朴。富贵苟难图，睡驾从所欲。陶潜饮酒诗其五。结庐在人境，而无车马喧。问君何能尔？心远地自偏。采菊东篱下，悠然望南山。山气日夕佳，飞鸟相与还。此还有真意，欲辨已忘言。